We're now going to hear from Mr. Tom Goldberg. You can see his background in the bio sheets, again, that you have either printed out or emailed to you or on your smartphone. He has a long and very thorough involvement in issues related to cybersecurity. And you'll see a very interesting overlap between the kinds of damage that could be done. And that's why the questions that came up over the day as to why we should have sort of like not only an all hazards approach to these issues, but an all venues approach to cybersecurity makes a lot of sense. And he will also be talking about some, not only the serious effects of a cyber attack, but how insidious those attacks may be, because there may be things inside your chips on your computer boards that you may not even know are there. And he's going to explain some of the very subtle issues that go back to our supply chains globally when we talk about cybersecurity and the difficulties we're facing. And on the other hand, what might be opportunities if we dare to confront them. So now I'd like to present Mr. Tom Goldberg.
Thank you very much. I'll address at the... thanks. I was asked also to just briefly talk about the executive orders, the presidential policy directives. I don't have a slide to that, but I'll speak to that at the end of the presentation. Quickly, I want to bring you to the threats as defined in the headlines. Mike Hayden in 2008, of course, said 15% of our assets are secure in defense and intelligence, leaving the vast majority exposed. Just before retiring, of course, General Jones told executives from the critical infrastructure utility community principally to hang up the phone, in other words, disconnect from the internet. And then Keith Alexander, who now runs Cyber Command but also runs NSA, has said in a number of speeches, some of which we helped to write, that, look, this is the largest wealth transfer in all of human history that's going on through cyber networks that are connected around the world, allowing assailants to just take money out of banks and to take IP out of companies and then to plant themselves in utilities, in distribution networks, in pipelines and things of that nature. As we go down this list, you can see that the Chinese, who we consider one of the more sophisticated attackers in the system, basically have fifth-generation aircraft capability that they obtained from us. You may not have heard this, but this has been in publication in the full and open for quite some time, that we discovered in 2009 that for quite a number of years, Chinese intelligence officers were participating with Lockheed and their subcontractors in all program and progress review meetings. So they were part and parcel of all of the dialogue going on, resolving issues technically or announcing the progress along the line. And today, for all intents and purposes, your F-35 is owned by China. And all of their new aircraft, the J-20, J-31, CH-4 UAVs are, if not mirror images, they're so close they might as well be, and they cost a lot less. So in any case, you go down the list of the threats, NASDAQ testifying before Congress at the end of May, 1st of June. It depends on which record you go to. It's either the 31st of May, 1st of June. The CISO, who just came over from Sandia National Labs, and CISO's Chief Information Security Officer testified before the House Banking Committee saying they are in our systems. We cannot get them out unless NSA comes to our aid. In essence, what he also testified to is there is no NASDAQ trade that has integrity any longer. Since we don't control, or he says we, that's NASDAQ, no longer has the ability to authenticate and validate and verify each and every trade because of the penetrations made there. FTC says that about 9 million people a year lose their identity through identity theft over the internet. Probably more important for industry, and you'll see this at the very, very bottom. This is the very, very, very good work of the FBI, InfraGard in particular, reaching out to companies. DuPont in December of last year, because of the penetrations at its company, took all of its intellectual property off of all of its IT systems. They went back to a very old process of using DuPont couriers. Many of you will have remembered in the James Bond movies where people had little briefcases handcuffed to their wrists and they would travel around the world. That is the process that DuPont has returned to. Dow lost $1 billion worth of research, and the company you may not know much about, but is in Buffalo, New York, Lubrizol, was the beneficiary, if you consider this a benefit, of a hacking through the SCADA systems. That's a supervisory control mechanism that control processes, pressure, temperature, residency in a process that is the real gem of knowledge on how to do something in a process environment. Well, the Chinese had managed to get all of that data. They enticed a disgruntled engineer from Lubrizol to Vegas. They presented all the data to the engineer to get a reaction. The reaction was shock and horror. How did you get all this? Once they knew that the data they had was valid, they built a plant in South Korea. And in February of last year, they called up Lubrizol and basically asked for $1 billion in blackmail money, or they would run Lubrizol out of business by making the thermoplastic polyurethane, which is an aerospace-grade polyurethane, and do it at a fraction of the cost. Well, Lubrizol bought that plant for $1 billion, took a charge against its earnings. It's only, at the time, a $2.3 billion company, so that's half of its revenues. In November of last year, after negotiating with the South Korean government to tear down the plant, Warren Buffett bought it at 4 cents on a dollar, which means that all of the assets owned by the shareholders was lost. And these are real events. So when we look at the EMP moment, what I want you to think about by the time I get to the end of this talk is if we help to correct some of the activities in this area, we will be doing service in the area of concern to you in EMP. Now let's go to a kinetic effect. We've heard about Stuxnets, but Stuxnets is a bit ephemeral when you're looking at, if you will, centrifuges going at 1,000 times their normal rate of rotation. Let's look at a real kinetic effect. This is actually an event where the Georgian government, thanking the Russian government for having a short war that moved a pipeline out of Georgia and back into Russia, and you may remember this from about 10 years ago, bought 1 million administrator addresses from the Chinese, because administrator addresses reside on chips. These are burned in on the chip, and they identify each and every chip. And then they pinged around the world, because the Chinese didn't know where all the chips went. And they pinged around until they found the one that they wanted, and it happened to be in a new computer, in a processor, on a server, in this power plant in Siberia. And they identified that one of the 9 hydro turbines was in lockdown, tag-out moment for repairs. Lockout, tag-out is a procedure where if you don't do the startup properly, step 1 isn't done properly, you never even get entitlement to go to step 2. But because the chip had an administrator address on it that gave all privilege to the person owning that address, they dialed up stage 1 of that turbine, drove it out of 6 stories of solid concrete and steel, killing 75 people and destroying the entire turbine house of this hydroelectric plant. So this is your kinetic moment. In the little yellow boxes there, if you can see that, that's the size of the human beings examining the destruction after the event. So that gives you a scale in terms of magnitude. When we look at economic effects, the very, very first news conference that Christine Lagarde gave after taking over the IMF had in its very first sentence, "Shame on you, China, for manipulating the votes and minutes of secret meetings of the IMF to serve your own geopolitical interests." What happened were a couple of members of a particular meeting that had voted in a particular way on a decision had discovered that the minutes, when published, were very much different than they recalled from the meeting. So they went back to the recorder notes, which are these semi-cardboard papers that the recorder, the court reporter type person, generates, read an entirely different outcome than that which was published. And the reason was, again, the Chinese using chips that had administrator addresses in them that they had the privilege to, were able to drill all the way through everything that was protection at IMF, and I'll stress this as we go along, and basically they owned that access. So if you can imagine, if you will, you're Maxwell Smart, for those of you who remember Get Smart, and you're at the end of that tunnel at the end of the day and the doors are closed on you. Well, this administrator address privilege moment provides where all the doors open up. Instead, there is no encryption, there is no firewall, there are no air gapping mechanisms if you have access in even the most remotest way to these things that will deny you privilege. Leon Panetta, I've already talked about NASDAQ, but Secretary Panetta, in a speech, again, before financiers in the utility industry not more than a month and a half ago, just basically said we have to look out for a cyber Pearl Harbor because, in essence, everything that makes up the electronic networks that we rely on, including all of the PDAs and things that we all have these frailties to them, and that state actors, that we call state actors anybody that we don't like, basically that's another country, uses these addresses just as they sold them to the Georgian government to give to organized crime around the world. And you have to wonder, why is it the Russians, if we write 1 million lines of security code for 1,000 line code, can break in? Well, they're not breaking in because they're smarter software writers. They're writing to the address on the chip. And so they don't need a lot of code to be able to get around the mechanisms that we currently employ to protect ourselves. These are national security concerns. Probably the biggest one that is not really enunciated here but should be is that every time somebody penetrates your system, it isn't what they take that's most important. It's what they left behind, which is basically that latent kill switch or that ability to destroy the asset that controls something or will leave behind an instruction that, if it's targeted, will cause some catastrophe or failure in your system. And depending on how your system operates and what it's connected to, again, you've heard all day about cascading events. And that the number of attacks is constantly increasing. We've given up in many quarters trying to really count it, but put it in a log basis that daily it's increasing by that. And the reason is that the number of administrator address privileges seems to be, if you will, percolating more. This slide was done by Verizon, the U.S. Secret Service, Dutch high-tech crime unit. They've been doing it on and off for a couple of years. This is a euphemistic slide. It's deliberately trying to send a signal to the government that we need help. But if you look at the really, really big circle, it says that essentially that 81% of my vulnerabilities are installed or injected by some remote actor, meaning the manufacturer who sold you the computer, or the chip fab that actually fab the chip, or the packaging facility that packaged the chip. And then as you go down, you basically look across malware, virus, and all of the other vectors we hear a lot about, and in reality, they're infinitesimally small by comparison. The supply chain. It is very complex. We built it in a manner of speaking to advance profits. We did this beginning in the 1980s with new theories and business school, finance schools, if you will, management schools that basically said if you deleverage the manufacturing asset, your expense goes down, you own the customer, you own the profit, and guess what? Your profit will explode. And so what we first did was we began to give to second parties in the middle of the country the ability to make our computers. Then we shipped them to Mexico. Then we shipped them to China. Well, what do the Chinese do? They have their own enlightened self-interest. So they began engineering on top of our engineered product, and we got back many, many things that we now no longer can control. But the convoluted nature of this is if you're in the IT community, and I am in that community, when you buy a part, you never really know if you're dealing with a manufacturer. You may be dealing with a broker, he or she may also be dealing with a broker. So the depth and the breadth of this is so complex that what we have to do is literally collapse this back in on itself to get even a chance of getting hold of who's really in that loop. The state of the market today, everything is outsourced. Virtually everything is outsourced. The size and complexity of it, as I just said, is so enormous that when the RAND Corporation just did a classified report for the Secretary of Defense, their conclusion was that the industry supplying the assets to the department had no idea how deep their supply chain was and how interconnected it was. So they gave up on that. We have been blessed and cursed by performance enhancement. Each one of us today lives in the Buck Rogers world imagined in the 1930s. It's real. It's here. And yet it's cost dominant, which means we get it at almost no cost. It's the way that John D. Rockefeller began his business making kerosene. He gave away the lamp as long as you bought the oil. We get an awfully inexpensive device. It is highly functionalized. It is a screaming demon. If you're like me, I used to race cars. We love to see that thing log on and boot up as fast as possible. We can watch movies on a train, whatever it may be. But security is an afterthought. Now, when we, and I was one of a dozen or so folks asked by the Secretary to go around the country almost 2.5 years ago now to talk to the industry and say, you're all Americans. Do your patriotic duty, bring some of this manufacturing home. I was given good coffee, occasionally got a note of Spunkmeyer cookie, then I was shown the door. And the reason is that the U.S. market for integrated circuits, if we look at the U.S. government component of that, is 3% of what a chip manufacturer has as sales, not large enough to make a dent. And if you're looking at a systems integrator in the one that has the largest number of sales, and that's Cisco Systems, it's only 11% of revenues. So there is no driver here to really bring it back. When we look at how we're going to implement the changes that I'll briefly describe now, which is an instruction that was issued by the Undersecretary for Acquisition Technology and Logistics and DoD's Chief Information Officer. It is called 5244. It's the supply chain integrity requirement. Every division, every office that has a procurement function or a design function in DoD now has to issue regulations that essentially require that if a vendor sells a product to the DoD, the entirety of that supply chain is understood and that security trumps cost and other concerns. And the reason we need to do that is we have to get to the designer. And not all designers reside in the United States. In fact, a lot of the code that is used to design a chip was invented in Germany. A lot of the coders are Russians or Belarusians or folks that are in the Philippines. And if you look at databases that are generated as information databases, if you look at the workforce, it's not in the United States entirely, more often not than here. When you look at your operating systems, your packagers, your appliance assemblers, you're going to have to go back to some level of control that we have had in years past. We call it the Trusted Systems Program, TAPO, if you're at NSA, or Trusted through DMEA, which is the counterpart to TAPO that is within the Office of the Secretary of Defense. What are our control capabilities? I listed them down here. In the blue is what we can actually do in the United States because of the supply chain. In the red, by virtue of sovereign rights for other nations, we will not be able to achieve. On-site inspection will not be allowed because, and the most recently retired president of China so stated over 18 months ago. Lifecycle controls, because you can't embed at those locations, means you can't tag it, track it, or locate it. And vetting of all the suppliers if they're in foreign nations is an impossibility because of sovereign issues. But that's where we have to go. So, achieving a secure supply chain really has taken life as of the 5th of November of this year in 5244. And we have to have in that visibility, cradle to grave. We have to do validation and certification, and that involves people, companies, facilities, systems, processes, and parts. And here's the kicker. If you sell an electronic component, a widget, a device, or a system to DoD and it contains taint. Taint is the deliberate manipulation on the chip, or it's counterfeit, which means that you bought something that has a label on it to do something when it was really an older generation or not designed for that purpose. You're fully liable. So if the aircraft falls out of the sky, the missile fails to hit its target, you're liable for the whole system cost. And that's the driver here. Now, none of this is feasible in the current global COTS footprint. So we either push oversight overseas, or we're going to have to return manufacture to the United States. So that gets me to Presidential Policy Directive 20. It's a classified document, but I'm only going to tell you what the Washington Post published about it. So we'll limit authenticity and validation and verification to what the Post believes it says. But let's assume that there's some credibility here. And that is that the president may interdict any attacker anywhere in the world through cyberspace at their point of origin, or even remotely if that can be targeted, which means that anybody's computer anywhere that might be the transmission component in the internet can be destroyed or disabled. And that includes, in the United States, if you're the target, your systems, to prevent a catastrophic event from occurring. There's a lot of credibility to that. The second one is an executive order that's been meandering around. It hasn't quite issued. I was hoping it would issue by the time I got here. I keep praying for it because I'd want to be able to talk to the specifics. So I'm going to talk a little more ephemerally to what I expect will be in this executive order coming out next week. I pray it comes out. And that is that because we have legal authorities that are very limited in interdicting the private sector owned internet, which is about 90% of everything that we use, we are going to see authorities emphasized, not enhanced. That is to say that if EPA has an authority to regulate emissions of air coming off of a plant, and it has SCADA systems that are vulnerable that could be compromised to cause emissions from occurring, they're going to have to change the SCADA systems under their air permit, under their NPDES water permit, under their RCRA hazardous waste permit. The same goes with FDA in terms of the controls that exist on the manufacture of pharmaceuticals, at USDA with regard to meat packing, and down the line. So any federal agency will be told to use their existing authority in the absence of new statutes, which I will explain in a minute are not likely to occur, to essentially require the repair, the replacement of vulnerable systems. Now, at the moment that that goes forward, the EMP community ought to basically say, and oh, by the way, why don't you harden it against pulse? Because we're going to tear out those systems. Now, a case in point, and I alluded to it very briefly, you may have seen it at the pipeline moment at the beginning. Telvent, Spanish company that had installed SCADA systems throughout the United States, Canada, Central and South America. About 60% of that infrastructure is all common because the industry got together and said, hey, we're going to have to come to each other's rescue. We ought to know a little bit about each other's tools, right? So there was good intent for putting that in. They have reported to all of their customers that all of their SCADA systems are penetrated. So they have to be torn out. They have to be replaced. They have to be hardened for cyber purposes. There's no reason why not. In that process, they shouldn't also get a EMP incentive. And that really requires for a community like this to go out and say, it doesn't cost much to shield. I mean, you've got companies like ARC Technologies and up in Amesbury, Mass, that does this for lots and lots of people. Why the hell not give them a little more business to put their foo-foo dust in these components, and then it'll be done. So I'm going to just close with this and then maybe take a few questions. This is the consequence if we fail to act. Thank you to the Toronto Post. I saw this in the drawing board section of the Post, and I just had to get a copy of this. And so this is one of my mantras now. You know. So maybe one day I'll have a chest of medals showing that I fought this battle too. I'll be happy to take any questions.
First question from Dr. Clay Wilton, who's been a scholar researching this area for some number of years and does cybersecurity at UMUC.
Thank you. I want to ask you, you're getting into preemptive cyber attack, which seems to be an emerging policy for cybersecurity, since we're starting to say, well, we pretty much have to give up on the defense part. I've been reading lately where researchers and hackers are being paid money because of a new global market for sales of zero-day exploits. The purchasers of these zero-day exploits are nation states, maybe some businesses, and potentially non-government organizations, extremists who may be using proxies. So do you have an opinion about how it's possible to control the sale of zero-day exploits so that they don't just create a cyber arms race? Or are we beyond that point now?
My opinion is we're well beyond this. Those of us who have been working this area behind the scenes in various offices have seen this going back to the year 2000, Y2K. I was sitting in a skiff with a number of members of the administration, and Bob Rubin was asked, so how much is it going to cost us to in lost revenue because of the backdoors, Trojans, and so forth that will be burned in because we've outsourced the ability to correct that 2-digit to a 4-digit moment? Because we didn't have people living in the United States that could write C, COBOL, Fortran, and fix the problem. The answer was $4 trillion. The first time I ever heard the number trillion, and my jaw dropped. So we've been dealing with these kinds of issues, not specific to the zero-day moment, but these issues for a very long time. We just haven't paid much attention to enhancing our defensive systems. And we really do, if you're going to take CrowdStrike, made up of a lot of former FBI agents who recently left this year to start that company, their advice to clients, the first order is tear out your hardware, tear out your software, start over. So that tends to be where it is. And in answer specific to your question, what will the administration do? I think the administration has chosen to pound its chest and basically say offense is our best defense right now.
We have another question from Dr. Chris Beck.
Hi. I noticed on your last slide that not the cartoon, but the one before that, the last bullet, either push complete oversight overseas or return manufacture to the U.S. Probably the former is not likely due to sovereignty issues. So you told an anecdote about going around to companies and asking them about bringing their manufacturing back, and you were shown the door. I was just wondering if there were any analyses of cost differential that we would see if chip manufacturing was done domestically versus overseas, and what the difference in the chip itself would cost and what the difference to an overall system would cost.
Very good question. It's very, very low. And we know this because the IP losses of the companies that make chips. If you look at, and this is a quiet revolution, so there's hope on the horizon. I really mean there's hope on the horizon. Apple just announced today they're bringing an assembly function back. The rationale given, all of our IP is being stolen. We need to come somewhere where we can protect our IP. So if Apple's going to move it back, you can imagine Intel's moving some of it back. We do know quite a number of people whose IP was stolen. I want to give you one case study very briefly. The largest selling encryption chip, the ProASIC 3, made by Actel Microsemi, was fully penetrated at Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation and had been done so for years. And they are our ally. 1 million plus backdoor keys found in there by Cambridge University in a paper that was published over the summer but was first released in April of this year. So when you think about the ubiquitous nature of the threat, it isn't just coming from people you might consider your adversaries. It might, in fact, be your friends.
Any analysis done kind of the DuPont or Dow model of pulling stuff off the network, but from a SCADA perspective, instead of ripping everything out and redoing it, the reason that attackers can get in, it's on the network. Any analysis been performed of just pulling these systems off the network and just keeping them almost as an intranet within the corporation or the utility company itself?
There has, and it depends on the company. They're doing a number of different things, but the principal way of doing this is, since the chips in the pumps, valves, and controllers for temperature, resonance, stir, whatever, have themselves been penetrated, they're being sanitized by being replaced. Now the networks themselves are being revisited. The use of Bluetooth or RF connectivity for enhancement is being changed to very much hardline in a closed loop fashion in some cases. I don't think anyone's going to go back to the engineer or the process mechanic. And by the way, I grew up in the chemical industry when I was very young, and we actually did have people who turned valves on schedule and did read meters to determine if things were running properly. But I don't think we're going back to that. But you have to sanitize everything in the system. You can't just isolate the system, and we know that from this fact. How did we get Stuxnet into the centrifuges? Well, it was an air-gapped system, meaning that it didn't connect to the internet at all. And it was in a closed building, and it was in a place where people had to have authority to go into. Well, flooded the market with thumb drives that basically had Stuxnet on it. And eventually one got there. Why? Because an engineer, and this happens, this is the human frailty moment, and we're all human, actually brought something into the system they shouldn't have. And that's the human factors component of this, but I won't go any further on that. So.
And one last question from Energy Liaison from Congressman Bartlett's office.
Hi, I'm Lisa Wright. You indicated that you'd get to the question of legislation compared to an executive order, and I invite you to do that now. And I'll just add, if we are in a world where Congress cannot legislate by statute to provide the stability of statutes, and we are in an executive order world where the authority lasts only as long as the current president, that opens another whole set of questions.
Well, thank you for that question. Here's the frailty in the system, and it is not Republican, it isn't Democratic. It's civil libertarian versus collaboration between government and industry. The administration, both the Bush administration and the Obama administration, have attempted to work with Congress to get legislation to enable us to share data across government and industry, and civil libertarians won't have it. The fear of Big Brother is so intense that in the Senate in particular, you're going to get an endless number of filibusters. It simply is not a bill, in my estimation, that you can expect to come off the floor of the Senate for that reason. And those are very, very sincere people who believe in freedom and in all of those aspects of freedom that are attendant to not having Big Brother in your bedroom. The difficulty is, and this is the odd nature, or if you will, the inevitable part, is that Colonel Zhang, and it's a made-up name, he is in your bedroom, but the federal government of the United States will not be. And that is because of the connectivity of the world and the access that people have and the like. There is another provision here that is very contentious, which might be resolved, and certainly has been called for to be resolved by Secretary Panetta. And that is that if you look at the systems that you own today, the providers of those systems are liable to you for the losses you have sustained. If you're Citibank or Goldman Sachs or you're a utility or you're Lubrizol and all of your information was stolen, is there somebody at fault? So there is an absolute drive by the industry, made up both of the hardware and software providers and those that employ them, the internet service provider community and what have you, to be exonerated from those liabilities. And until such time, they too are opposing the enactment of legislation that would enable us. So with regard to executive orders, they can survive if the new administration going forward chooses to continue to enforce them. But that's the only mechanism legal remaining. that is a federal authority and in this particular space. You should expect, beginning in the next year, maybe the year following, a lot of litigation that might force the courts to get involved. I don't know really where that would lead, but those are the mechanisms that are available. They're being employed. I think they're doing the best they can with what they have.
Thank you very much. The battery of this one just died, just in the nick of time.
Or kept going in the nick of time, I should say.